So my name's Wendy Ratcliffe. I'm one of Her Majesty's Inspectors and I'm Principal Officer for Early Education in our Early Education in Schools policy team, and really pleased that Sam's with me today. Sam, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm an early years regulatory inspector. I work mostly in London.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, so before we get moving, one of the things we'd just like to say is that we'd like to start by saying a huge thank you to all of you in early years for what you're doing to provide all important care and education for our youngest children. And we recognise what challenging times it has been over the last, and I have to keep trying to think however long it is, but you know the period of time I'm talking about. If we can move to the next slide, please. So what we'd like to do today in today's session, we will talk briefly about the EIF inspections and EYFS and the DfE's updated EYFS, and actually what does that mean for our EIF inspections. We'll then go on to look at assessment data and workload issues, the curriculum, and then the role of assessment. Some of the key messages we want the sector to understand. When looking at the curriculum, we'll explain that DfE's new non-statutory curriculum guidance development matters, what this means to Ofsted education inspection framework. But what we think is really important to remind everybody about is that our EIF methodology hasn't changed. We continue to inspect in line with the principles and requirements of the EYFS, and as a result, of the changes to EYFS that came in September that you'll all be familiar with, we've made some small amendments to our handbook, and we've explained these in a table on our website, and we'll provide the link with the slides after this presentation. One of the other things we just want to reassure people about is that we continue to follow guidance from Public Health England and prioritise the safety and welfare of everyone involved in inspections, including children, carers, staff, inspectors. And we continue to use the two-stage notification call where this is appropriate, so inspectors and providers can have that fulsome conversation regarding conducting an inspection safely. Okay, we'll also then have some time to look at what we're finding from our return to inspection. We returned back in May, and then hopefully, as Jill says, we'll have some time for some questions at the end. Okay, next slide, please. So let's just start with the EYFS and our inspections. Next slide. And very briefly here, just some of those changes to the early years foundation stage framework. And we all know the importance of communication and language and how it is crucial to young children's overall development. Being able to speak clearly, understand others, express ideas, and interact with others are fundamental building blocks for a child's development. Children who can communicate well are more able to make friends, play together, and access the full curriculum offer. Good curriculum design coupled with effective, sorry, there's lots of pings going on in the background, pedagogy and care is important to all children, and especially those who may be disadvantaged. And reducing excessive paperwork can free up time for providers to focus on what matters most and to get their curriculum and provision right for all children who attend their setting. Taking endless photos of children on electronic devices to create evidence for inspectors, or colouring in squares, green, amber or red on a spreadsheet to provide data for Ofsted does nothing to improve children's learning. We want early years providers to be spending time with children, talking to them, listening to them, playing with them and teaching them. And the revised EYFS also puts that strong emphasis on children's health. There's a stronger focus on children being highly active physically and developing their skills, fitness and stamina. There is also now a specific requirement to promote oral health, which we know is vital to many children, especially those who are disadvantaged. But let's just deal with a myth in the making. Inspectors will not be looking to see that every child has a toothbrush. Next slide, please, and I'm handing over to Sam.
Thank you. So you'll all know that the educational programmes, which are sometimes referred to as the early years curriculum, are the areas of learning and development which set out the skeleton of the early years curriculum. Settings should continue to use the educational programmes to decide the approach to their curriculum that is right for their children, and then put the meat on the bones alongside the revised EYFS. Next slide, please, Jill. You'll also be familiar with the revised development matters, and you'll know that this has been designed deliberately to be shorter and easier to read, while shifting the focus away from the unintended consequence of it being a long assessment checklist and put the focus in the right place towards being curriculum guidance. And this is to help providers put together an ambitious, sequenced and enjoyable curriculum that meets the needs of every child. Providers will be able to use their professional judgment based on their knowledge and experience instead of what was happening previously, where providers were using the early learning goals or age bands in the framework to track children's progress. It's a really useful tool for providers, helping them to shape what they offer. And while it's not compulsory, the DfE recommend that providers use the Development Matters non-statutory curriculum guidance with the new statutory framework. And what does that mean for our Ofsted inspections? Well, we do want to make it clear that inspectors are not required to use Development Matters while on inspection, but they will want to find out how providers decide what it is they want their children to learn and how they decide the sequence of their curriculum, or in simple terms, why this, why now? And we recognise that some providers may choose to use other guidance, and while Development Matters is the guidance recommended by DfE, inspectors will want to find out the effectiveness of their curriculum and the impact that it's having on children knowing more and remembering more, making progress.
And I think that's important there to remember, Sam, isn't it? As you've just said, that actually, you know, we recognise that Development Matters is non-statutory and it is there to support providers to put the meat on the bones, but we also recognise that there are other tools out there that providers might want to use alongside it or in addition or instead of.
Absolutely.
Next slide, please. Okay, so what does this mean on inspection? So let's have a look at some of the key things about EIF inspection. And I think this is a good opportunity just to remind us about EIF and where we've come. So it was back in September 2019 when we introduced the Education Inspection Framework, and we'd only completed 6 months of that new framework before inspections were suspended. And this framework was not only built on 26 years of inspection experience, but was also the most researched inspection framework in the history of Ofsted. We've been open about our research, we've published research commentaries, blogs and videos about it. And this framework plays a significant role in enabling Ofsted to fulfil its objectives set out in its strategy. And that is to be a force for improvement through intelligent, responsible and focused inspection and regulation. And this slide represents that original case for change. The Education Inspection Framework moved away from that focus on data and outcomes in favour of a focus on the curriculum and what children know, can do and understand. We know that prior to EIF, far too much time, work and energy was spent producing assessment data that Ofsted might want to see. There was an emphasis during inspection on data that evidenced how children are progressing and tracking outcomes for particular cohorts of children. Production of this data often meant an overemphasis on observation and assessment, and in some cases, practitioners working to checklists of developmental milestones rather than focusing on delivering a broad curriculum for children and then measuring its impact. Perhaps most important of all, overly focusing on data and outcomes has the biggest negative effect on the children we should care about the most. Children with special educational needs and those who are disadvantaged. Inspectors will not look at internal assessment data, and the Early Years Inspection Handbook and the Schools Inspection Handbook clarifies this and makes it clear. Our Education Inspection Framework has moved away from a focus on data and outcomes in favour of a focus on the curriculum and what children know, can do and understand. Next slide, please. So let's just remind ourselves of the EYF judgments and the role of inspectors. As inspectors, we're charged with finding out what it's like to be a child in this early years setting, the preschool or with a childminder. Inspectors will use the inspection methodology or those inspection activities set out in the handbook, spending time with practitioners and children to find out what it is like to be a child here. What you should expect to happen is all set out in the inspection handbook. And if you're not sure about something, then please do ask the inspector, either during the notification call or on the day of inspection. We want providers and childminders to have the confidence to do what they do every day and not to do anything different just because the inspector calls. And just looking at this slide, the quality of education judgment, that puts the real substance of education, the curriculum, at the heart of the inspection. But of course, we also remain very interested in children's wider development, looking at the behaviours and attitudes they bring to the setting. Leadership and management, of course, still remains a key area of consideration. For schools, EYFS provision, nursery class and reception, is considered as part of the whole school and the judgments reached. And there is an EY judgment which focuses in on the quality of education for early years. Other factors within the early years will feed into the other judgment areas as well. But again, that's clear in our inspection handbooks. Next slide, please. And because we inspect in line with the principles and requirements of the statutory EYFS, then in September 2021, we made some amendments to the handbook so that it reflects the new statutory framework, that it reflects the period in which there were the disapplications for the EYFS that ended on the 31st of August, that it reflects the changes on the EYFS on personal, social and emotional development, and that it provides clarity on inspection preparation and practice for both inspectors and for providers. However, as I've said already, there's no change to inspection policy, and we must continue to inspect in line with the principles and requirements of the EYFS. And you can find a full summary of the changes published on our website. But Sam, you're going to take us through some of those now, aren't you? Yeah. Next slide, please.
So one of the changes is to the section on inspection and the COVID-19 coronavirus section. We will want to know if a provider has previously relied on the disapplications so that we're able to understand the context of where they are now, as we have done since we returned to inspection. However, we will continue to not judge providers on what they were doing previously, even if they were disapplying or relying on modifications. We'll look at whether any previous reliance on the disapplications or modifications is having an impact on the provision and on children. And it's important that we look at what the provider is doing to get back on track, how they're addressing any gaps in children's learning, helping children to remember and practice things they may have forgotten, and ensuring the children are ready for their next stage of education. Next slide, please. And one of the other changes is the updated criteria for personal development, which mean that the early years grade descriptors are fully aligned with the education inspection framework and schools. By making these changes, we're ensuring all children are offered the rich set of experiences that promote understanding and respect for people, families and communities beyond their own, and prepare all children for life in modern Britain. This is a really important change, and we're sure that you'll all agree that routinely challenging stereotypical behaviours should be a given in early years settings. If we get this right early, then it sets children up well for life in modern Britain. Next slide, please. Wendy, over to you.
Sam. And we've also added some additional text that to clarify that inspectors will not analyse a provider's internal progress and attainment data during an inspection. And finally, the September handbook has a brand new section clarification for providers. This, we feel, is a helpful section for providers and for inspectors. Next slide, please. Thank you. Within our inspections, it's important that we focus on what matters. We all know just how important a child's early years are, and that children learn more in the period from birth to 5 than in any other time in their lives. And as I said, as inspectors, we're tasked with finding out what it's like to be a child in their early years setting. Therefore, we must find out how practitioners decide what it is that their children need to learn and why they do what they do for their children in their setting. And then finally, how do they know what they do is effective? You may have heard of cultural capital, and this is part of quality of education. We want to find out how practitioners identify what the children in their setting know and can do when they arrive, what their gaps are, and how they decide to fill these gaps. We know that what practitioners do and the experiences that they provide can make all the difference, particularly for those children who are struggling. The children are at risk of falling behind. The best time to help them to catch up and keep up is in the early years. Every child can make progress if they're given the right support. Even more important now with the challenges of the pandemic, children having had some time away from their early years settings, and making sure children experience what they have missed. And Sam, you're going to tell us more.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Ofsted's definition of the curriculum is the framework for setting out the aims of a programme of education, including the knowledge and skills to be gained at each stage. This means that the curriculum gives structure and a sense of direction for the work of early years practitioners. Not everything can be written down, but practitioners need to identify what knowledge and skills they are teaching. Alongside this, they must have a reasonable workload. In early years, practitioners need to plan and deliberately teach children specific knowledge and skills. For example, teaching children to understand the concepts of 1/2 and 1/4 in mathematics through a fruit cutting activity. Practitioners would need to have decided what knowledge and skills they're teaching. And there may be times in the early years too that they plan more open-ended opportunities for children to explore and represent their ideas through play. This is a focus on the curriculum being what knowledge and skills that practitioners teach children, and less on the learning environment, ethos, or pedagogy, or activities selected by practitioners. Next slide, please. So this is a statement from the Early Years Inspection Handbook and is Ofsted's view about the EYFS. The EYFS provides the skeleton of the curriculum, and it's up to early years providers to put the meat on the bones. This is where early years daycare providers and childminders may find it helpful to use the revised development matters. This is one way of putting the meat on the bones. However, it's not statutory and Ofsted will not expect to see it or inspect against it, but we do recognise that providers need to use something to translate the high-level curriculum in the EYFS into something that can work as a progression model. The DfE's revised development matters can help, but we recognise there is other guidance that early years providers may choose to use. The EYFS educational programmes provide the curriculum framework that leaders build on to decide what they intend children to learn and develop. Leaders and practitioners decide how to implement the curriculum so that children make progress in the 7 areas of learning, and evaluate the impact of the curriculum by checking what children know and can do.
And at Ofsted, we think about the curriculum as the progression model. By this, we mean that progress means children knowing more, remembering more, and being able to do more of what was intended in the curriculum. And in early years, this might mean knowing sounds of farm animals or that the oven gets hot, the meaning of countless words, knowing what facial expressions suggest. It can also mean know how to hold a pair of scissors, know how to catch a ball, that we should take turns and how to do so, know how to dress and undress a doll, know how to hold and turn the pages of a book, and so on. It also means knowing behaviours and habits for the future. Know to look at the person speaking to them, kind hands, and know to listen when others speak, and that we sit and listen to stories. We can say that these things have been learned when they are remembered. Therefore, the curriculum is making progress. The curriculum sequences the knowledge that children need. Inspectors on inspection look at what providers teach children and if children know and remember that curriculum. And this is not a discussion about internal data. Next slide, please. And one of the things that we had a greater focus on when we introduced the EYF is the importance of children's communication language. And that's because there's a wide variation in children's exposure to vocabulary. So it's important that when considering the curriculum in early years, that we consider children's vocabulary and consider this a part of their prior learning. And we know that there's that real disparity in the vocabulary experienced by different children correlated to social class. And that disparity has been found repeatedly in research since that landmark study by Hart and Risley. We know the importance of language and communication in early years, and because of this, we have that increased focus in the handbook on the importance of vocabulary and of early reading. Just think for a moment, how does it feel to be a child who doesn't understand the communications shared with them, or the stories they are read because they don't know the meaning of important and crucial vocabulary? Next slide, please. Sam, let's now look at the role of assessment.
Thank you. If we could go to the next slide, thank you. So a clear curriculum enables practitioners to focus on what children need to learn next. And day-to-day observations and ongoing assessment allow practitioners to find out what it is that their children can do already, what they already know, and what interests them. It also helps them to identify what children are finding tricky to learn, and that gives us the opportunity to provide some extra help or support. And in this way, assessment is part of the day-to-day delivery or implementation of the curriculum. Then, using this knowledge, they can then decide what it is they want their children to learn next. On inspection, we need to explore the extent to which leaders identify what children cannot do and then help them to do it. Remember, a good understanding of the 7 areas of learning equates to a good understanding of child development. Next slide, please. So providers must have arrangements in place to support children with SEN and/or disabilities. However, in early years children, they don't usually have a formal diagnosis, and therefore it is important that practitioners do not only offer support where there's a formal diagnosis of SEND. Early identification in early years is crucial, along with effective intervention, to help children receive the support that they need and reach their potential. We can reduce the likelihood of a child falling behind if we use assessment well, and the bullet points on the slide illustrate some suggestions. Being ambitious for all children and recognising that some children don't benefit from the same advantages as others, and being determined that they will do well. In this way, we help children to keep up and reduce the need for catch-up. Wendy.
Next slide, please. Thank you. So just some really important key messages there, I think. Assessment should be useful and not take practitioners away from children for long periods of time. And we know that effective assessment can reduce that likelihood of a child falling behind. Early identification and intervention are key in helping children to reach their potential. Early years providers should be ambitious for all children, recognising that some children do not benefit from the same advantages as others, and being determined that they will do well. Next slide. So how does all this fit together? Curriculum, teaching and assessment are intrinsically linked. When all 3 are aligned and of the highest quality, they should facilitate effective learning for all children, irrespective of their starting points. In turn, this should translate into all children making good progress. And it is through effective assessment that we can find out whether the curriculum and the teaching has produced the learning we intended and decide what next in terms of the knowledge that we want children to learn and develop. It's important to remember that knowledge should be taught to be remembered, not merely encountered. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm just conscious of time, but we're just going to go over some of the other judgment areas. And over to you, Sam.
Thank you. Very quickly. If we move to the next slide, on inspection, we'll also look at children's behaviour and attitudes and personal development. Childcare settings play a crucial role in ensuring that children are equipped with the knowledge and skills that improve their life chances. And we consider that children's wider development is important to ensure that they can prosper and lead successful lives. We will, of course, as we do with all of our work, continue to inspect the safeguarding arrangements and continue to focus on 3 core areas. And inspectors will continue to judge whether safeguarding is effective or ineffective. So in terms of identify, how do leaders and other staff identify children who may need early help or who are at risk of abuse? And what timely action do staff take to ensure that children get the right support when they need it, including preventative work, and how well do they work with other agencies? And then in managing safeguarding, how do responsible bodies and staff manage their statutory responsibilities? And in particular, how do they manage safe recruitment and respond to allegations about staff and other adults? We will continue to work to make sure the focus is right. Safeguarding should not be confused with health and safety. We want children to take risks and climb trees. Next slide, please. So what are we finding from inspections since May? As we returned to inspection, providers told us about some of the ways they'd changed the way they organise their setting in line with COVID guidelines in place at the time. So we found that they were doing more activities outside, staggering handovers and pickup times, incorporating hygiene into daily routines of their settings through increased hand washing and teaching about germs and the importance of hygiene, and their communication with parents. In part, this was driven by the changes to handovers, but they were using other ways to make sure parents were reassured about the safety of settings, virtual tours, social media, to show how new COVID secure their environments were. And if we move to the next slide, we're just going to look at some reflections on return to EIF. It is very early days. We're only a few months into inspection, and the points on this slide will probably be familiar to you. We did publish the findings from our conversations with providers in our COVID briefings. And our inspection evidence shows that providers recognise the importance of the curriculum for communication and language, so children have the skills they need for the future. Outstanding providers are exceptionally skillful in developing children's communication and language, for example, through skillful questioning and animated storytelling. And overall, we've seen settings giving more attention to the prime areas of learning. We've visited many good settings where leaders and managers understand what they want their children to learn. They've shared their intent with the staff, and staff teach children well. So around PSED, for example, leaders, managers and practitioners are focusing on supporting children to make friends, think about how they interact with others, being kind and to listen to one another. Reports of weaker providers indicate that staff frequently do not have the skills and training needed to support children's learning through purposeful play and meaningful interactions. They lacked the skills and knowledge to meet children's learning needs and help them manage their behaviour and feelings. When we're keeping a close eye on this.
Thanks, Sam. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just interested to know, have you seen this? So this is our new page on gov.uk, and you can find it from our handbook page. We've put this together to help providers, schools, local authorities and inspectors. We know rumours start about what it is that Ofsted might want to see on inspection, and we've responded to some of these through frequently asked questions here. Have a look at it when you get a chance. And everything we do on inspection is set out in our handbooks too, so have a look at these. The EY handbook for registered early years, and then there's the school's handbook for EY provided in a school. Next slide, please. Just here, you'll have access to this. This is just some of the information of what else we've got published out there. Sam mentioned earlier about the COVID-19 series briefings that we did back at the end of back of 2020, where providers told us what they were finding. We're also continue to publish information on joiners and leavers, and we're also publishing data on reported cases by registered EY as well. So there's lots of information available on our website. Next slide, please. And Sam.
I won't spend too long on this slide, but many times we're asked, when will I have my inspection? And I suppose there's no quick answer to this, except to say that all providers, including yeah, it depends. All providers, including childminders, will be inspected at least once after their first inspection in every 6 years window. So we've moved from a cycle to a window, and the time between inspections will depend on the grade given at the last inspection. We may also decide to inspect if we receive information that gives us cause for concern about the childcare that you're providing. Next slide, please. So just a bit of information about what happens after the inspection. As we said, early years now aligns with the other remits in regards to the timescales of reporting as part of our post-inspection 2020 project. And this allows you, the provider, better opportunity to review the draft report and submit any comments about issues of factual accuracy and about the inspection process for us to consider before we finalise the report. We will consider all comments and we'll respond to the comments when we share the final report with you within a maximum of 30 working days after the visit. And to quality assure our inspections, we may also visit some providers to quality assure our inspectors on inspection or remotely monitor evidence. Our inspectors receive rigorous training and follow the Ofsted Code of Conduct on any inspection. And feedback is shared with inspectors and influences inspector training. Sorry, Wendy, I need to cough. Do you want to take over?
Thank you. Yeah, just a couple of other things there on that slide is that there is also as well our complaints process. So if a provider did want to submit a formal complaint, you will have until the end of the 5th working day after receiving your final report to do so. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, and just before we go to final questions, if we've got time, Jill, I'm not sure we have, because I know that we were running slightly over and we've taken some time to go through those slides. But Sam, just as an inspector, any final words from you about inspection that you would like to give?
Put me on the spot, but I would say be confident to showcase to us what you do day in and day out, what you know about the children and what you want them to learn while they're with you. We do appreciate the uniqueness of each setting and the children and staff who are part of it. And I think, to echo what the other speakers have said, we acknowledge that everyone's experiences, particularly over the last 19 months, are individual, and that I and my inspector colleagues recognise the efforts that you've all gone to ensure that children continue to receive good quality education and care.
Thank you, Sam. So I think a message from us is do what you do every day. Don't do anything different just because the inspector calls.